Hello to all. My name is Karel Vereycken. I'm a member of the French LaRouche organization. And tonight I want to share some of the research I did recently about a very hot issue in many elections in France, in the US, in Germany, called Islam. So I made a little PowerPoint with some images and speaking points, also because it will help you, to see some of the names, because I'm always afraid if you want to take notes and of the dates and the names, it's much easier to have this kind of PowerPoint. So this is my starting image where I opened the School of Athens. Needs to be reorganized, and we don't only need the Western philosophers, but there is a huge section of our academy, School of Athens, which should be opened to the beautiful humanist contributions which were made during the golden age of Islam, and which are very few, which are nearly not known at all. Most people only know maybe two names: Ibn Sina, Avicenna, and Ibn Rushd, Averroes. But generally, that's where it stops. So I will try to give you an idea of what happened on the right side of the room in this School of Athens. So you see, I took two dates here: 753. Actually, I made an error. It's 63. Is the foundation of Baghdad, 763 in the 8th century, and 1258 is when the Mongol Empire smashed Baghdad, burned the houses of wisdom and hundreds of books, and killed hundreds of scientists in Baghdad who were killed by the grandson of Genghis Khan, who was leading the assault on Baghdad. But we will come back to that. So I wrote a paper which will be published in the upcoming issue of Lenore, which replaces Fidelio. The next issue, it's being edited. It's 59 pages, the French version with the images. So tonight I only will give we will go through it as a summary. I will not tell you everything which is in. You can read it afterwards for all the details. So I will split it up basically in three parts. Little introduction, which I'm giving now. The role of astronomy. Then I will speak about something very new, which is still in the process of being discovered and worked on by historians, which is a theological and philosophical school called Mutazilism. I will explain that. And then we will talk about the rise and fall of the Abbassid Caliphate, which was based in Baghdad. So first of all, I want to start with a contradiction. Today we have all these horror images of terrorist attacks, decapitation, suicide attacks, bombings, killings, all complete barbaric acts which are done in the name of Islam, so-called. And then if you look into the history of the Quran and what the Surat and the sayings of Muhammad, you find things which do not correspond at all with these barbaric deeds. Here I took three quotes which are generally attributed to Muhammad. The first is, the ink of the scholar is holier than the blood of the martyr. The ink of the scholar is holier than the blood of the martyr. So that's a pretty strong statement. Then it says, you should seek knowledge from the cradle to the grave. When you are born, your mission is to seek knowledge. Obviously, we can say, some historians say, yeah, but when they say knowledge, they meant the knowledge about God. They didn't mean knowledge in the way we think about natural sciences. That can be discussed. And then they even say, you should seek knowledge even as far as China. You know? If you can't find it in Germany, go beyond. So this is completely contradicting and it doesn't fit at all with these fundamentalist ideologies which are doing the barbaric acts today. And you will, so we have to find a way to understand and to explain the paradox. Why is there this paradox? So what is accepted today after the Second World War, the contributions of Arab civilization, science, there are some things which are nevertheless, which they couldn't really erase from the memory. First of all was contribution of the astrolabe. Astrolabe was developed by the Greeks as a theory. They never built it. And it's only in the 9th and the 10th century that the Arab navigators and the Arab scientists developed the astrolabe, who became a very important tool for navigating on the stars and the maritime Silk Road. The second thing is, they say, yeah, so there were the Greeks, they basically they didn't invent anything, basically, but they knew about the Greeks and they translated from the Greeks in Arab, and then we, the smart Europeans, we retranslated them from Arab into Latin. And that's how finally the Greek heritage came to Europe. So this is partially true, but then they say mainly the Greeks, the Arabs, they were very much, you take Al-Ghazali, you take Averroes, they were the people who really introduced Aristotle, because the basis of Greek civilization is Aristotelian logic and empiricism, that you only learn by the senses, by the sense perception. So there's a lot of emphasis to say, well, the Arabs, they helped us rediscover Aristotle, so they did a good contribution to Western society. And then eventually accepted his contributions in medical science, mainly Ibn Sina, who was corrected by Leonardo da Vinci, but whose canon of medicine was printed in Europe, translated to Latin, and you nearly have to wait till Pasteur or somebody before people found something better. The reality is that Al-Razi, who was a Persian, worked in Baghdad before Avicenna, and Ibn Sina mainly worked on Galen. Galen was a Greek doctor, Platonic doctor, working in Alexandria. And through the Arabs worked a lot on Galen and some other key Greek doctors who were very advanced and made the basis for medical sciences. So this was somehow, up till the recent years, what was more or less admitted. Now, since 2000, the woke culture, and not only from the left-wingers, but also from the far right wing, there's a whole campaign now to come and say the Arabs did zero. There is no contribution at all of Arab science or culture to European history. The first thing is this guy, Serafin Fanjul. He's a Spanish former communist historian, a lot of diplomas. And he wrote a book called Al-Andalus, Invention of a Myth. As far as I did not yet look really into Al-Andalus, but what I saw mainly is that Andalus tried to imitate Baghdad. Everything what is good in Al-Andalus was already done before in Baghdad, and they tried to capture the best of Baghdad, the Abbasid culture, to Spain. The theory of why it's a myth is that they say, well, we have invented this fairy tale that the Jews and the Arabs and the Christians, that they lived in peace and that they worked together. But in reality, all this was dominated by the Arabs. They obliged everybody to speak Arab, and the Arabs were exploiting the Jews and the Christians like slaves to work for them. And it was not at all a relation equal to equal. And this is a fairy tale. This is the new thesis coming out in Spain by this guy, Serafin Fanjul. Then there was, in 2008, a book which created a lot of uproar in Europe. Initially, the book was sold for 21 euros, called Aristotle and the Mont Saint-Michel, because they found a scriptorium on the Mont Saint-Michel in the year 1000, where there were a lot of Greek manuscripts. And then they said, well, this proves, they didn't wait for the Arabs. They had already all the Greek manuscripts. So the idea that we needed the Arabs to know the Greeks is all bullshit. And they have this guy, Sylvain Guggenheim. So the book came out in 2008. It was sold for 21 euros. Today you go on Amazon, it costs 600 euros because everybody wants to buy this book. It's a stupid book with no illustrations. But it has become a reference for the entire right-wing populist European sphere. People who say, well, immigration, we don't need it, it's enough. And we didn't need the Arabs for the European culture. We don't need them then, and we don't need them now. And then even more recently, The Myth of Andalusian Paradise, published in 2016, also by a conservative right-wing think tank, where you see on the cover, you see the Arab armies, Andalusian paradise, and then you see these these Arab warriors, making war against the Spanish. So there is a campaign. So now the people who say that we nevertheless needed the Arabs, they say basically there has been a hole in the history of astronomy. They say there's a black hole for 1,300 years between Claudius Ptolemaeus, 2nd century, and Copernicus, the 15th century. They say in between there was nothing. Nothing happened. Now, if you look what Copernicus, Kepler, Nicholas of Cusa, they all knew about. I have here the list of the scientists. Copernicus. Copernicus knew. Copernicus, in his book called De Revolutionibus, he quotes Al-Battani, who was an Arab astronomer, Al-Bitruji, Al-Zurqala, Ibn Rushd, Tabit al-Qura. Copernicus also referenced in another book to Al-Battani. So there was extensive knowledge. Kepler quotes Avicenna, and Kepler referenced also to Ibn al-Haytham, al-Hazen, on the works on the eye, on the whole work on lenses and perspective and other parts. So this story that, the European elites and the scientists, they got access to several prominent Arab astronomers, and they knew about it. So as I said before, Arabs were so-called only translators, nothing more. But we have to recognize that they built observatories, astronomic observatories in Baghdad and Damascus. I will talk about that later. So then I want to speak 2 words about the presence of astronomy in the Islam as a religion. If you are a Muslim, you have to pray 5 times per day, right? Now, yeah, the hour of the prayer changes every day. One day it's at 5 o'clock, then it's at 5:15, then it's at 5:30. Today, all the Muslims in Paris, they have their smartphone and they look the Paris Mosque, and the Paris Mosque gives them the hours, you know. You have you see here on the screen, you see what people have no smartphones and no telephone. They had a little stick. You know, people in the desert areas in Yemen or Saudi Arabia, they would go out with a stick and they would measure. They would know the direction of the shadow and they would see the length of the shadow. So they could measure the hour, and they knew exactly at what time they had to do their prayers. So the idea of Islam is that 5 times a day you have to tune your own existence with the planets. You have to measure yourself with the universe. And that's the idea of prayer. It's not to repeat some stupid sentence, but that you have to reflect on that you are acting in the universe, and that you have to tune your own action into the harmony of the universe. So astronomy is something of the daily life of every Muslim. Then, of course, if you build a mosque, you have to know in which direction. And then the Islam is also based on the cycles of the moon. Now, the moon, as you all know, it's 29 days and a half for one cycle. A month, according to the moon. The Chinese have the same problem. It's 29 days and a half. Now, if you take 12 times 29 days and a half, you only have 345 days for a full year. Well, as you know, a full year is 365 days. How much? 6 hours and 9 minutes or something. So this created a kind of paradox, because the imam and the and the priests and the theologians, they like the astronomers of the Chinese emperor, they had to predict when the moon appeared. You know? The emperor would say, well, in 3 days, the moon will appear. And then if it didn't appear, the astronomer was finished. So anyway, this brought, you can read in my paper, the thing is, the Arab astronomers, they start working on this, and they did enormous breakthroughs in the domain of spherical geometry, because they started looking to the eclipse. They had an idea of the circumference of the Earth, the size. If you have an eclipse, you see the shadow of the moon on the Earth. You can get an idea of the distance. You can measure the angle towards the sun. And then they took from the Indian mathematicians and geometers, they took the sinus and the cosinus, which is much easier to calculate with sinus and cosinus than with what they call a chord, which is a curve, which is very hard to calculate. So they took major breakthroughs of Indian mathematics for their astronomical calculations. And then this new science helped them to do. They calculated the size of the planets, the orbits, the eclipses, geography. They did maps, the astrolabe, and then navigating on the star. Because this all generated a crash program where we had spin-offs for activities which were not religious as such, but which were useful for human society. Now, the key dates here are the following. 622 is called the Ejira. This is the time that the ruling families of Mecca, they think they kicked out Muhammad. At that time, there were 300 different gods in Mecca. And Muhammad came, he said, no, there's only one. And we're all equal in front of God. And then they said, no, this is not something you should say too much. So in 622, he was obliged to leave, he was threatened to get killed, and he moved to Medina, which was an oasis, was nothing at that time. Then he creates a group of people, and they start building a city, they do a government, they do even a constitution of Medina, where they say that Arabs are equal to non-Arabs and Muslims are equal to non-Muslims, except in front of God. So now the drama is, the tragic reality is that most Muslim countries afterwards will practice slavery. While Islam explicitly condemns and forbids slavery. It's completely no way. There was even a slave of Muhammad. He had a slave, which he liberated, was a black slave, but a very good voice. And he named him to be the muezzin, the man who announces the prayer on the minaret. And which has to know astronomy, because he has to know the hour at what time he should announce the prayer. So there are passages in the Quran which clearly indicate that this was at least during its founding, was something very revolutionary and very progressive at that time, whatever it became afterwards. So then immediately you had different clans which pretended that they had the right after the death of Muhammad. There is a lot of discord. And people say, I know better than you. My family knows better than your family. Like in Florence in the 13th and 14th century. And then starting from 1656, you have the Sunnites, and 4 years later, the Shiites. And it has nothing to do with religion, it has to do with power. And they already start fighting each other. And then around 750, which is 100 years later, appears a young man called Wazil ibn Atta. And he is thought to be the founder of this Mutazilism. Mutazilism comes from a word which means I am in retreat. It says, you guys want to fight, okay? Don't like it? I pull out. I look to you from a higher standpoint. The Mutazilites, they were opposed to this. Then I put as next date 749. This is when the Umayyad dynasty is replaced by the Abbasids. Umayyad dynasty, they didn't like producing. They did slavery, they did trade, but they didn't really like producing stuff. I will show you later what the Abbasids started doing. Then 762, and not 753, 762, foundation of Baghdad by the 5th Caliph, Al-Mansur. I will show you later. Then 786 arrives Harun Al Rachid, who will open up diplomatic relations with China, Xinjiang, and with Charlemagne, 3 diplomatic missions to Charlemagne to fight the Umayyads together between Charlemagne and the Abbasids together against Byzantium and against the Umayyad, which were a colonial system. Harun Al Rachid will stay 23 years in power, and then comes later his son, takes power in 813, and who stays another 20 years in power. So we have, it's more like the Italian Renaissance. We have a short period of 2 generations, 43 years, where we have a real humanistic outlook and policy. It would be like having 40 years of Roosevelt. No? Roosevelt we only got from 33 till 44. That's hardly 11 years. If you imagine Roosevelt for 50 years, the impact would obviously be completely much bigger. And then Al-Mamun, before dying in 1833, he makes Mutazilism the official doctrine of the Abbassid Empire, of the Abbassid Caliphate. And then there is a lot of, I can answer questions, there's a lot of infights afterwards, which brings that in 1848, Mutazilism is abolished as state doctrine. And then they bring in Al-Ghazali, the Ash'arites, which are the fundamentalists, which you can discuss about philosophy is bad by its own nature. It's only theology. And then the caliphate then more and more calls in the aid of foreign powers, be it the Persians, be it the Turks. And then finally, in 1258, you have the fall and destruction of Baghdad, which is wiped out by the Mongol invasions, which first go to wipe out the Song dynasty in China. They take Poland, they take Kiev, they take Moscow, they take Samarkand, they take Bukhara, Genghis Khan and his son and his grandson. It's 3 generations of. The British are completely fascinated by the Mongol Empire because it was the biggest empire ever in history, and the most barbarous ever. So they like it a lot. But this, so that's the fall of Baghdad in 1258, when the books are burned. There are thousands of scientists which are executed, thrown in the river. But during these 43 years, the seeds have been planted as the and they will give a lot of fruits during their own lifetime and during these 40 years, and also afterwards through their spreading all over the world. Okay, now the 5 basic principles of Mutazilism. The first principle is you have to see that this arrives also in a period where we have Zoroastrism, the Mazdeism, the Manichaeism. You have all these dualistic worldviews where we have good and bad and light and shadow and completely dualistic outlooks. The Mutazilism come in and say, no, there's monotheism, there's a single unity. God is a one single unit. First point. Second, man is defined by human reason. Third, the Quran is not increated. The Quran is created by man, not by God. If it had been written in Sweden, it would be in Swedish. If it is a created entity, then we can discuss about it. We can adapt it. We can change it. We can have discussions about what is the interpretation. The Quran is metaphorical. You cannot take it literally. This is all these things which we fought the religious war, Luther and Erasmus, against the Inquisition. All these theological problems which we had during the wars of religion in Europe, they were already solved by the Mutazilists. They also say God is the primal cause. Now, this is true. This is a little bit Aristotelian. If you read Aristotle's Metaphysics, God is the primal cause, and then there are secondary causes. But the Mutazilism said you can study the secondary causes, and you can see a reflection of the first cause. It is only a reflection, but it tells you the beauty and the harmony of nature and the creation is a foretaste of God's wisdom. And God remains the first cause. The second point is that God is good. Everything which is created is good. Evil is the result of human action or inaction. Man is defined by free will, and we reject predestination. The mektub, in Arabic, there's the mektub, which means it is written. Because for the fundamentalists today, if the chairs are on the floor, it's because God today decided the chairs are on the floor. If tomorrow the chairs are on the ceiling, it's God decided that they are on the ceiling. There is no lawfulness in the universe. All is the will of God. If things are as they are, it's only the will of God. That's the fundamentalist view. The Mutazilism says no. There is a legitimacy, and man has a free will. Third principle is that man is accountable for his deeds. Since he has a free will.
Question, just so I understand it, I think you said it differently, but there, if you read that, evil is a result defined by his free will. Evil doesn't come from free will.
No, it's badly written.
Yeah. Okay.
No, it's not evil. It's man is defined by his free will. So if he does something bad, he is responsible because he has a free will. So he's accountable, and there will be a last judgment, where he has to face what he did with his life. And then very important, what they call, with the Mutazilism, called the intermediary degree, is that today for the fundamentalists, if a Muslim kills somebody, he does a major crime or a major sin. From the moment he does that, he's not any longer Muslim. And if he's not a Muslim, you can kill him. He's a kuffar. It's less than an animal, which can be eliminated. While the Mutazilism, they say no. As long as he's alive, he can change his. He can his bad deeds before dying, and become a good Muslim. So the fourth point was one of the major disagreements with all the other branches of Islam at that time. And the fifth point, which I like a lot, that the mission of man is to order the good, to put order in the good, and to blame things which are to blame, which are blamable. And if this means that at one point, if you have a bad king or a bad caliph, you have the right to become a rebel, the right of rebellion, because it's justified, but you have to order the good and blame the blamable. If the caliph is bad, you can blame him. If he's even worse, you can kick him out. So this, of course, is a kind of optimistical humanist vision, which completely is the opposite of all what we see of Islam today. Now, this is a map of the Abbasid Empire when it had the largest extension. You see, it's basically around the Tigris and the Euphrates, Sumer, the rich valleys of Tigris and Euphrates, Baghdad. You know that Baghdad is on one river and Babylon was on the other. And then you see the whole Middle East. You know, you see Kurdistan, Armenia, the South Caucasus. You have Khorasan, which is Iran today, Bukhara, which is Uzbekistan, with Samarkand. You have Bactria, which is Afghanistan today. Herat is Afghanistan today. Very beautiful mosque in Herat. You have, so you have a whole part of course, the empire of Alexander the Great, till the Indus in India. And then you have Iran, you have Iraq, you have the entire Middle East, the entire Arab Peninsula, North Africa, Morocco, up to Spain. This gives you an idea how big it was. This is in 809. This is Harun Al Rachid, Abbassid Empire. Okay, so what did they do? First of all, contrary to the Umayyads, they started massively investing in infrastructure, canals. If you look Sumer, I thought, you know, most people think Sumeria was very rich because it was very rich land. You know, if you look to it, it's completely dependent on irrigation. It's much less fertile than Belgium or the Netherlands. If you don't have irrigation in Sumeria, you get no food. So the canals were a very important issue. Then they developed massively this famous Qanat. The Qanat were the Persian underground canals, what they call horizontal drilling. You had a mountain. The thing is, you had mountains, especially if you go beneath the Hindu Kush. There's a lot of ice in it. It melts. It runs from the mountains, and instead of forming a river and going to the ocean, the water just goes down in the sand, disappears underground, becomes an underground river, aquifer. And then people stand in front of the mountain and say, my God, all the water disappears. I can't cultivate. So they built a horizontal tunnel. They did a well in the mountain, and then they did horizontal tunnels. 4 or 5 kilometers, 20 kilometers, 70 kilometers. Oasis, the Roman aqueducts are using this technique. The largest aqueduct in the Middle East is 174 kilometers. It's partially underground, mostly underground. It's 100 kilometers underground. So this was taken up. Then they did dams. They did even underground water mills. They did underground canals with water mills inside under the ground water mills. They did windmills. They developed the postal system. They had the La Diligence before Louis XI and Benjamin Franklin. The Abbassid, they had a postal system. They started raising cattle, camels, horses, cows, cereals, producing silk, fruits, vegetables, olives. There was a major fight for paper production. Paper was invented in Uzbekistan, developed by the Chinese, but they did silk paper. Because the Chinese, they write with a brush, and they do only one side. So if you paint with a brush on a silk paper, you can't use the back side of the paper. So in Uzbekistan, they added things into the silk paper to make it thick, so that you could write with a pen on the paper and use both sides. So there was paper, you should know, was invented long time before printing. Paper was not invented for printers. So they had paper production. Harun Al Rachid will develop massively the paper production in the entire Middle East, Damascus, Sicily, Spain, Northern Africa, all over the place. They had metal production, and even Al-Razi, he actually invented kerosene by distillation because he had brute oil. They used wolfish oil for their lamps, which is terrible. Then they developed kerosene, which gives a lot of light, and it has, kerosene is the highest density fossil fuel we have. That's why you put it in airplanes. But it was actually invented by these Persian and Arab scientists in the 10th century. Then they took over the hospital system of the 3rd and the 4th century from Gondishapur in Persia, where they developed the first hospital system. In Baghdad, they called in the Persian doctors to build the hospital system. Actually, when they decided the place where to build Baghdad, they put sticks with pieces of meat on the sticks, and they waited for 3 days, and they looked to the place where the meat was the mostly destroyed. There they didn't build a hospital. They built a hospital on the place where the meat was the best, survived the best. What?
Preserve.
Yeah. Because they want the best air for the sick people. Al-Razi already built hospitals with separations of pathologies. Instead of, if you put all the sick people together, they contaminate. Well, you contaminated one person with, you finish up by having everybody contaminated. So he did the hospital with several sections, separate. And also, if you think the 10th century, if somebody was mentally ill in Europe in the 10th century, they would throw him in a pit, and let him die. Well, in Baghdad, in the 11th century, they had special hospitals for people which were mentally ill. So talking about civilization, it is revealing. So then the diplomacy, as I said, there were embassies to Xinjiang under the Tang Dynasty. There were 300 foreign nations in China represented in Xinjiang, trading. The traders were the Sogdians. The most spoken language on the Silk Road was Sogdian. Sogdian is from Uzbekistan. They were trading from China to Europe. And then on the art, under Harun Al Rachid, so the first caliphs, they build up libraries, they build up their courts, they bring in poets, they bring in musicians. And then, especially under Mamun, he will make all the royal, all the culture of the caliph will be given to the people. The library of the caliph will become a public library. The books on the market, the poets and the writers would go every Saturday on the market and talk to the population about their discoveries, about the books. And there was a book market in Baghdad, immense, where people would come to meet the authors. They translated Arab fables,
Yeah.
like Dimna and Kalila, which is very old Indian. It's very, very funny. It was used by La Fontaine. It's about jackals, and it's the first book is called How to Make Friends. The second book is How to Make Enemies, and it explains. It's actually a book to educate the prince, educate the leader of the government. And the jackals, they do a complete conspiracy to manipulate the caliph. It's it's one of the best sellers of Eastern literature, Oriental literature. I really advise it. I gave it to Jacques for his birthday, and he read it from the first page cover to cover because it's very funny and it's very interesting. What?
What's the name of it?
Dimna and Kalila. You will find it. Then there was also a lot of music. Now these fables, there are illustrations. You have miniatures because it's really funny. And so for illustrators it was perfect. So there was a lot of painting in the books, also frescoes, architecture, poetry. All this was part of their culture. Not like Islamic culture today. This is an artist's view of the city of Baghdad. It was based on a Persian scheme. The Euphrat, they built a special canal which would go through the city to use the infrastructure of the river to bring in the goods inside the city. Baghdad, up to one point, they go up to 400,000 people. It's absolutely huge. They did special canals along the river to divert, to avoid what you had in Germany, floodings. They would take water from the Euphrat and put it in the Tigris by canal. If there was too much rain on one side, they switch it to the other. It's absolutely amazing what they were able to do. And the only problem is today nearly everything has disappeared. Why? Because they used the bricks of the buildings were done in mud. And at the end of when the Abbasid Empire collapsed, they abandoned the whole irrigation and canals, and the water came in, and the water dissolved the buildings, who became mud. So this is a big drama that we have very few physical remains of Baghdad today, but it gives you an idea. So these are some of the things I talked about. On the left, you see, this is Cordoba in Spain. You see this big wheel. It's actually a wheel which takes up water from the river and brings it. It's an elevator of water. The idea is not to generate power, but to transfer water from a lower point to a higher point. In the middle, you see an astronomical treaty with the constellations of the stars. Today, 50% of all the stars used in navigation have Arab names. And this is paper. This is a special thick paper developed in Baghdad, as I said before. On the right, on top, you have an underground bathing room in Persia, 2,000 years old, because this underground kanat went under the houses of people. People had in the basement, they had a special bathing room where they could have this hygiene. Actually, there is a récit, there is a description of a princess in Damascus. She described the arrival of the Crusaders, and she says, "These people stink. They never wash. They are so dirty." And they had the perfumes and the roses. Then on below, on the left, these are the vertical windmills in Persia, built 1,000 years ago. At that time, it was a big progress. Not like now. Now they are reinventing vertical windmills, which turn like a revolving door. This is these were windmills used to grind wheat in Persia 1,000 years ago. And then you have also in the middle a floating water mill on a ship. So the idea is when you have a river where there's a strong current, you put the ship and you attach it on the sides of the river, and the water runs underneath and make the wheels turn. And then when there's no current, well, you take it to another place. You're not condemned to be on a fixed site. You can bring it where the energy is, and then get the energy for your water mill, which is on a float, on a barge, basically, which is quite smart as a concept. And then on the right down, you have this is the diplomatic mission sent. You see Charlemagne standing on the right with a sword, and the people bring in a camel and an elephant, which are all the gifts of Harun Al Rachid, which were sent to Charlemagne by the Arab Caliph. So that gives a little idea. And then the most known thing was the famous houses of wisdom. So on the left, you see all les étagères. You see the shelves on the wall. See all the books on these black pieces you see on the wall. These are books, and they are reading together a text and discussing. They're analyzing and discussing the text. This is in Basra in Iraq today. They were in one of these houses of wisdom. Then this is a artist representation based on this part of the building still exists in Baghdad, the House of Wisdom, and they made a kind of. So what happened in these houses of wisdom? First of all, it became from a private library, it became a public library. Then it became an observatory, because what they did is they translated, for example, Ptolemy's, the Almagest, and they said, let's check it out. It's true or not? So they built an observatory, and they started doing all the measurements to check it out if it was right or not. So they start correcting, and there are many books. For example, they say, my doubts on Ptolemy's. Every astronomer, Arab astronomer, would translate Ptolemy's. Ptolemy has been translated. I mean, the thing is, it took 40 years, but like every 2 years, they would redo a translation. And they had also to invent the language. And to show you the difficulty is that, well, they brought together, first of all, they brought all the knowledge of that time together. The Hebrews, the Greeks, Pahlavi, which is an Iranian language, Syriac, Sanskrit, and Indian. Actually, what we call the Arab numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the 0, they come from India, from the Indian scientists. And they were brought to Baghdad, and they became Arab numbers. And then especially what you should say, the early Christians, they basically had 3 languages. They had Greek, Latin, and Syriac. Syriac is Aramean. Christ spoke Aramean. It's a Semitic language. But they had, so because you have the Greeks were basically in Alexandria, in Egypt. And in Syria, there were schools, and they were doing a competition with the Greeks in Egypt. So they started translating all the Greeks in Syriac. And they had a lot of experience in doing this. So when the House of Wisdom were created, Arab was really Arab was very primitive. So they decided, instead of translating from Greek into Arab, it was much easier first to translate from Greek into Syriac, and then from Syriac into Arab. Because the Syriac was a highly developed language, which you could perfectly translate from Greek to Syriac without downsizing the whole thing. And then they worked and they worked and they worked, and they invented the Arab language became something really fantastic. You have Latin translators. When they go back to Gerbert d'Aurillac in the 10th century, avec la Reconquista, when they go to Spain, they find these Arab treaties. I have a translator who says, "Oh my God, I have to translate this Arab book in Latin, and the notion of being in Latin we have 2 words. The Arabs have 24 words. How can I can't translate this into Latin? It's too far too advanced. So you see, so the translators themselves, which were brought in, were Arabs, of course, Jews, Christians, and Hindi, and Persians. Persians, like some Persians, they were former Buddhists, they were former Zoroastrians, and they became Muslim. But they knew all these languages. If you knew all the languages, you were on top, of course. So now the people which were very much involved in this from the Christian side were the so-called Nestorians. Nestorius was first he was a Catholic priest in Rome, and in the 3rd century he was kicked out of the Vatican. Why? Nestorius said, I can admit that the Holy Virgin is the mother of Jesus. That I can admit. But to say that the Holy Virgin is the mother of God, no, it's not. It's beyond my comprehension. And then he said, sorry, you're an heretic. He was condemned as a heretic. And then he was kicked out. And then he said, if you don't like me, I will go out, organize somewhere else. And he went to the Middle East. He went to China. And they built up the Nestorians way before the Jesuits went into the East, to Central Asia and entire Silk Road. And their language, their liturgical language, is Syriac. So in the early 9th century, with Harun Al Rachid, Timothy I, who was the father leading the Nestorian church, he says, I put my headquarters of the Nestorian church in Baghdad. So the Christian Nestorian church settled down in Baghdad and collaborated for 40 years with the Arabs to translate all the astronomy, the philosophy, and so on and so on. So some of the leading figures, I have the whole list in my paper, but one you really should know about is Al-Kindi. Actually, there were 2 teams because, of course, if you have to translate into Arab or Greek astronomer, you better know something yourself about astronomy. So there were 2 teams. Ibn Ishaq, who was a Christian, he was an historian, but he was an astronomer. I mean, most of these people were polymaths. They were philosophers, astronomers, they were geographers, they were poets, they knew everything about water management. For example, Al-Kindi was a specialist in water management. Al-Khwarizmi, who invented algebra and the algorithm, the word algorithm from Al-Khwarizmi. He wrote 260 books. I mean, we have about 20,000 Arab documents which have not been translated so far, which are still there waiting to be explored. So this guy, Ibn Ishaq, tells, they had a division of labor where Ibn Ishaq had a whole team with astronomers. They would translate astronomy parts, and Al-Kindi would work on the field to translate Aristotle, Plato, which was mainly known through Galen. Galen was the Greek doctor, but he has written a lot on Plato, comments on every dialogue of Plato. You have a comment of Galen on the Timaeus was fully translated at that point in the 9th century in Baghdad. This we know. And then there was also what I put here. There was a very strong mission orientation. Al-Mamun, who was really the driving force of these houses of wisdom, he would be like Lin. He would go see the guys in the basement and said, okay, I want you to recalculate the circumference of the earth. We send out 2 teams, one in Baghdad, one in Damascus. They should do independent research, and then we put the results together, and we find out if it's coherent or not. But Al-Mamun himself, the Caliph, would really come in. He had four major projects. One was the circumference of the Earth. We calculated with more precision, with new methods. The new Eratosthenes. They say we need more precise measurements than Eratosthenes. And then, wait, find it. We had four main projects. Yeah. First task force was to have les éphémérides astronomiques, which are the measurements for navigation, which means where you are, at what point this or that star arises. And it's very important for navigation. More precise than Ptolemaios, who made one of the first. The circumference of the Earth, as I said, then to make a map monde, a map of the world, or globus. And then also, since Al-Mamun had been in Egypt and he had seen les hieroglyphs, he said he put on a special team to try to decipher the hieroglyphs, because everything he knew already was not enough. And so contrary to what has been then of course Al-Khwarizmi I put here, who did many things and developed algebra. So this is my last image before I take the questions. These are miniatures of the 13th century, remembering of what happened in the houses of wisdom. So on top you see a group of scholars listening to a teacher, and in his hands you see he has a book, and if you look carefully you will see it's not Greek, it's Syriac. The book, the signs in the books are Syriac. It is said, some commentators say this is Plato with his followers. Then on the left down, some say this is Socrates, which is getting very annoyed with the stupid comments of his pupils. And on the right side, they say this is Aristotle trying to explain how an astrolabe functions. Now, if you see, Aristotle is, instead of looking to the astrolabe, is looking to the chain. I like this image a lot, it's very funny. And the pupils say, you can keep it. Because, I mean, if you know how functions an astrolabe, anybody who knows who works in astrolabe knows that Aristotle doesn't know anything. He's like an empiricist, looking on the wrong part of the astrolabe. So it has some kind of fun in it. But I want to stop here